It is a great honor to welcome Professor André Gagné. He is the professor and chair of Theological Studies at Concordia University. And today we're discussing his latest book, American Evangelicals for Trump, Dominion, Spiritual Warfare, and the End Times. André, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
Okay. I'd just like to begin by asking you about your thoughts regarding J.D. Vance being selected as Donald Trump's running mate.
Very interesting choice, especially since we know a bit what J.D. Vance thought about Trump uh, prior to his selection. Of course, Trump has selected Vance probably to cater to his more conservative base. Now, I don't know to what extent he is very much impressed with some of the media interventions that Vance has engaged in. But essentially, Trump chose Vance most likely to show that he is sensitive to this more conservative, more religiously oriented base. Now, of course, Vance is not himself an evangelical. He is more of a Catholic. But still, for Trump, there were Catholics that supported Trump in 2016 and also in 2020, and it's probably will still be the case for this upcoming election. So, for him, it was probably the logical choice. Now, to what extent that will be profitable, we will see, especially with the new direction that the Democratic Party has taken with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. We will see if this will be beneficial for Trump or not, but it doesn't seem to be looking very well at the moment, at least. But there's still time. There's about a little less than 90 days to the election, so we'll see how that goes.
Yes. So do you believe that Vance is more appealing to the evangelical base than Trump's previous running mate, Vice President Pence?
The thing is, it's difficult up to a certain extent to evaluate that at the moment. We will see, but there has been, Pence was not, a lot of the evangelicals that had supported Trump in his first presidential bid. They weren't always satisfied with Pence, especially at the moment of January 6th, where he did not want to overturn the elections. Some felt that Pence had not been faithful to the Republic, that he had been a traitor in a sense.
Mhm.
So, up to a certain extent, maybe they think that it's going to be better with Vance. But at the same time, there's some quibbles with Vance because of his more. He kind of took a more moderate position in terms of abortion, um, and there has been some criticism with respect to his kind of softened perspective on this question. There has been criticisms with regard to Trump on this issue also, and that coming out of the conservative movement, of the conservative religious movement. So it's hard to see if he's really going to be that more appealing or not. Um, they're up against a lot of things. When you look at the Trump campaign, they're trying to gain a kind of a bring themselves more to the middle ground, still very conservative, but kind of being in their minds maybe more realistic on issues of abortion, um, kind of more sensitive to particular takes on abortion, like not abortion in every cases. So I don't know how that's going to play out. I know for a fact that there's been a lot of criticism of Vance's perspective on that, and even on Trump's stance on that question. So we'll see how it plays out at the polls. We'll definitely see. But Pence wasn't. Again, there were issues with Pence on the side of evangelicals, and Pence himself. It was never really clear how he identified himself. Like he like at one point he was describing himself as a Catholic, but a kind of a Catholic with evangelical sensitivities. So that too, it wasn't always clear, I think, with Pence in terms of where he stood. It was clear on where he stood on questions of abortion and stuff like that. But in relation to especially the election, on the idea that the election had been stolen, on Trump's promulgation of this idea of the big lie that Democrats have cheated. Pence didn't play along with that, and as you can see now, Pence stance with regards to even Trump's presidency is not very, very good. He's not very positive towards Trump's presidency. So and Vance, of course, he's the one that's chosen, but we'll see. There's no. I think time will tell. We'll see how they perform. It's going to be interesting to see the debates. If there are debates between Trump and Kamala Harris, and between Vance and Walz, it's going to be. Things are going to really play out when debates will happen. I think also, especially for these more conservative groups.
That's it. All right. So you mentioned January the 6th, 2021. So
Yeah.
how did I suppose, the majority of American evangelicals view that day and the events that transpired?
Now that too is very difficult because it's not when we talk about evangelicals, it's a complicated group of people. There are a lot of subgroups when we talk about evangelicals. In my book, I focus on one, for example, neo-charismatic Pentecostals, and we might come back to that question later on. But not everybody necessarily embraced what happened on January 6th. There were people that really felt into conspiratorial thinking amongst evangelicals. Estimates are maybe around 25% of evangelicals really embraced conspiratorial thinking. Ideas around the election having been stolen. What hurts a lot of these evangelicals, and the impression that we have is that, oh, many of evangelicals maybe embrace that, is that you have a lot of these key evangelical leaders that have social media platforms and are extremely influential. And they have a very large following. And if you're on Twitter or if you're on Rumble or on other social media platforms and you're constantly following these people, you have the impression that this is a large amount of people that really are embracing what's happening on January 6th. This kind of some people have called this insurrection. So, but I think we need to be very careful. There were evangelicals that were definitely there. There were key evangelical players and leaders that definitely encouraged people to go there and support what was going to happen and really believe that the election had been stolen. But there were other evangelicals that pronounced themselves very much against everything that happened, and it was a full-fledged demonstration of a willingness on the part of Trump to not respect the election and not respect democracy. So it's difficult. I wouldn't say that the majority of evangelicals, because we have a lot of evangelicals in the U.S. and it's pretty. You have evangelicals that do still support Trump, especially amongst white evangelicals. But you have some evangelicals that don't support Trump, especially in the African American communities that don't support Trump. You now have a new movement called Evangelicals for Harris. So you have evangelicals that really embrace democratic values as they are expressed in the U.S. and other evangelicals that, they see Trump as this special kind of anointed figure of God, chosen by God for this moment in American history to bring America back to God. So I think we have to look at who the supporters are. And even there, we need to be very careful, because you can ask people about, okay, you're supporting Trump, but does that mean that you necessarily endorse what has happened on January 6th? And maybe not. They would support Trump. They think that Trump probably reflects for them, their values, or he is the best defender of Christian, the Christian tradition or Christian values, or he hears their grievances. But maybe they don't necessarily share this idea that, the Capitol should have been stormed the way it was, and that the election should have been overturned. Uh, Not necessarily everybody would agree to that too. So even there, I think we need to be very, very careful. I think for us, the way to kind of make sense of Trump is look at how they perceive Trump as a key figure, how their theology actually speaks to that, and from there say, okay, if they do choose Trump for these reasons, there are consequences to that. And are they all very much aware of those consequences in terms of how democracy is expressed and viewed in the context of American politics?
Right. So you've alluded to something that I find quite important is that it can be quite difficult to define what does it mean to be an evangelical. We know that it means to be a Christian, to believe in Jesus Christ. But is it a matter of self-description, like you're an evangelical if you say you're one, or is it like a creedal faith where certain beliefs make you an evangelical?
Yeah, this is a very good question that has actually kind of plagued also scholars, trying to make sense of what is an evangelical. And there are sociologists and historians of evangelicalism that have tried to create some kind of typology of what is an evangelical. There's a famous typology called Bebbington's quadrilateral. It is something that was actually constituted by David Bebbington, who is a British historian of evangelicalism, where he actually identified, and this is how often evangelicals will self-define themselves, or at least recognize as being what would be evangelical. He kind of noted four characteristics. He said, for example, an evangelical is one that embraces biblicism. Biblicism is this idea that the Bible is central to faith and practice, that the Bible is the inspired word of God, and everything that we believe and everything that we practice as an evangelical is rooted in the Bible. So biblicism, the centrality of the Bible in matters of faith and practice. The second thing is the importance of conversion, meaning that individuals need to convert. They need to change their ways. They need to adhere to the message of Jesus Christ. They need to convert. They were going in a direction that was a sinful direction, a direction that was without God, without Christ in their lives. And conversion is changing this direction and following Christ. So believing in the message of Christ, converting oneself to the message of Jesus of Nazareth. So that's the second thing. The third thing is this idea that is called crucicentrism, which actually means the centrality of the cross, the sacrificial death of Jesus of Nazareth, that Jesus died on the cross to save humankind from their sins, and that this sacrifice is necessary to reconcile humankind with God. So that's the third component. And the last component is activism, meaning that the Christian message, we need to promote it. We need to be active in society to bring this Christian message to people that don't know it. So we need to be actively engaged in evangelism, for example. So usually, evangelicals, and even if you look, for example, on the website of the National Evangelical Association of America, which is a very, very important association of evangelicals in the U.S., was founded in 1942. When you look at, how evangelicals are defined, they use Bebbington's quadrilateral to kind of, say this, the particularities of evangelicals are defined as such. Now, this, of course, defines evangelicals. It's a typology. Now, aspects of this typology can also be applicable, and this is why, up to a certain extent, Bebbington's quadrilateral has been criticized by other scholars, saying that, okay, this is a typology, but up to a certain extent, some aspects of that typology can be applied to other Christian groups that are not necessarily evangelicals. For example, Roman Catholics would recognize the necessity of the cross of Christ to be saved. It's the sacrificial death of Christ that reconciles human beings with God. Would recognize the idea that one needs to convert. Huh? Uh, the issue of biblicism is a bit different in Roman Catholicism. It's not just the Bible, but it's also tradition in general. And of course, the idea of evangelism is still very important in Roman Catholicism. So you have aspects of that quadrilateral that is applicable to non-evangelicals also. You see, so it does define certain things, but at the same time, it doesn't explain evangelicals as a social movement per se. The rise of evangelicals in the middle of the 20th century with influential figures like Billy Graham and others that emerged out of the fundamentalist movement from the beginning of the 20th century. So it doesn't explain that. It just explains in discrete characteristics what an evangelical would be.
Okay. Well, since you mentioned Billy Graham and the fundamentalist movement, I think
Yes,
it'd be good to provide a working definition of that term too, because I know that evangelicals are often called fundamentalists by mostly secular people, not as a term of description, but as a term of ridicule.
yes, yes. This is a very good question, in fact, because when we think in terms of fundamentalism, first of all, we need to understand that fundamentalism was first and foremost a movement at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, in reaction to modernity. Okay, it was a movement in reaction to modernity, where in modernity, the scientific point of view was privileged, and a lot of conservative Christians felt that they felt that their faith, or more traditional faith, was threatened under this perspective. So they said to themselves, no, we need to read the Bible as it is. We need to read it as it presents itself. Like the propositions of the Bible, they need to be understood as is. And it's not about symbolism or allegory or whatever. It is what it is. When the Bible speaks of miracles, Jesus did miracles, and so on. So fundamentalism initially was a movement that emerged out or in reaction to modernity. And so we need to be very careful in the way we kind of frame that when we talk about evangelicals as fundamentalists, because we reduce often the idea of fundamentalism to literal readings of the Bible, like they'd read the Bible literally. But in reality, nobody does that. Nobody actually does read the Bible from cover to cover literally. They do understand sometimes that in the Bible there are things that are symbols, and there are where Jesus talks in parables that they're allegorical in nature, and Jesus does give interpretations of those parables and things like that. So we need to be careful. We're moving away when we're saying today, evangelicals are fundamentalists. We're moving away a bit from the original meaning of what that entailed, because evangelicals are not necessarily all against modernity, and they use modern tools and modern things to communicate their message. And and some of them still appeal to medicine and to science and stuff like that. So we need to kind of be very careful when we do that. Um, at the same time, the evangelicals that we have today in politics or in the world today are uh, are evangelicals that emerged out of the middle of the 20th century, but they are essentially neo evangelicals or new evangelicals that kind of, I would say, redefined themselves out of the fundamentalist movement of the beginning of the 20th century. You see, at the beginning of the 20th century, they were in battle, for example, against the teaching of evolution. One of the big issues for them was the question of evolution and science. And at one point in 1925, there was a big trial called the Scopes Monkey Trial, where you had a fundamentalist on one side and you had a more progressive kind of liberal, uh, you know, uh, lawyer on the other, and they battled it out. Who would win? And of course, the fundamentalists were ridiculed by the press at the time, and they were ridiculed to the point where they went on retreat. They kind of went into hiding because they had lost they had won the trial, but they had lost the social cultural war at the time because of the perception that people had of these fundamentalists as backward people that weren't aware of science and didn't care about science and thought that the earth was created in 6,000 years or something like that. So had been created 4,000 years ago, and the end of the world will be in 6,000 years or something like that. So the fundamentalists, the real fundamentalists of the beginning of the 20th century, went into retreat. And in the middle of the 20th century, you had a very energetic evangelist, preacher by the name of Billy Graham that kind of gave a new face to evangelicalism and to these former fundamentalists. And this is where there was a kind of a new constitution of what had probably been fundamentalist at the time into something new and different. And this is what we call now evangelicals, the neo evangelicals, the new evangelicals. And they've emerged out of that. But of course, they with Billy Graham, Billy Graham was very popular, very much liked by the American people and liked across the world. So he kind of, gave a facelift in a sense to these former, fundamentalists that had went into hiding. So that's what we have today. So, but I don't think that people are always aware of that kind of trajectory of the fundamentalist movement, losing the cultural battle and then re-emerging in a new form and a revitalized form through Billy Graham. And that's what we have as evangelicals today, you see, in the general sense of what we call evangelicals today.
I see. Yeah. And to add to the your account of the Scopes trial, I believe the lawyer who stood by John Scopes, who taught the theory of evolution, was Clarence Darrow, and the one that is refuting him was William Jennings Bryan, who's it was not one of his best days, but back then he was back in the 19th century and early 20th century. He was a very popular figure, and I would say a
very much
one too.
Very much. But he wasn't a biblical scholar.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was put on trial by Darrow, because Darrow called him to testify, he called Brian Jennings to sit, and he asked him questions about the Bible. And Jennings wasn't able to respond as a biblical scholar or even as a fundamentalist. Mm-hmm. He didn't have the right answer. And of course, when the media saw this, they ridiculed the entire fundamentalist movement. You see, because they kind of said, okay, if Jennings represents this, it's absurd.
Mhm.
You see, so that's what caused the problems. Of course, they won the trial,
Yeah,
and Scopes was found guilty, and but you know at the same time the public opinion went against
mhm. Now, you've
them.
mentioned that there are evangelicals today who are very adept at using the internet as well as other modern technologies. I'm
Mhm.
told that, Reverend Graham's son, Franklin, is a very
Yeah.
active user of the internet and a very active supporter of the Donald as well. So, with their
Yeah.
sophisticated use of the internet, so what would be their, I guess, moral qualms against what they deem to be modernity?
But for them, when you look at a lot of their grievances, it's often it's not about technology that much. As you say, they use a lot of everything that we have, but essentially it's putting man at the center. You see, it's putting human beings at the center and considering that the will of God should is not that important, that man becomes the measure of all things. Human beings become the measure of all things. And for them, when you look at a lot of the stuff that they kind of bring up and for what they will fight, it's often things like the family. For example, the notion of the traditional family. When you look at what has happened, even since Roe versus Wade in the early 1970s, the issue was abortion. But then the issue became also in those 1970s the rights of, uh, gay people in the 70s. And so it's often, or the place of, for example, issues around the Equal Rights Amendment, uh, you know, uh, women's issue, the role of women in the traditional family. A lot of the things are related to the family and how they see secular humanism as an assault on the family that does not respect the traditional mores of what the family should be and how Christianity has focused on the importance of the family and the role of parents and the role of children. When you look at a lot of their manifesto, a lot of their grievances, it revolves constantly around that. Even the modern grievances that we hear from a lot of the people that we hear about on social media, a lot of these, even the neo charismatics, for example, they're going to say, they're teaching our kids certain things in school, about transgender and LGBTQ and so on. We have parental rights. We need to know what our children are taught. So again, it's just like there are things that seem to change, but in the end, they don't really change. It's often around issues of the family. It's often around issues of not taking into account the biblical point of view on ethics and morality and life and politics and so on. And it's putting human beings at the center and becoming the measure of all things. So it's a lot of about that, and modernity has created that in a sense. You see, it has with the Enlightenment provided this opening for before that it was religious authority, it was the church, it was the Bible. Now with the Enlightenment, no, man becomes of age, man is resuscitated. And when they started discovering, Aristotelian texts and stuff like that, so it's all about that. And for them, this threatens their understanding of, the primacy of what Christianity is about and how people should live their Christian lives. You see, um, when we look at, you were mentioning like Billy Graham and others. It really depends on how you negotiate your tradition with other things. You see, in the evangelical tradition, often um, what is central, if you remember, is this Bible thing. It's this biblicism. It's about the Bible. So if it's not in the Bible, we have issues with that. But so what they're saying is that their lives, their ethics, their morals, their worldview is read the Bible essentially, and you'll know what it is. Whereas you're going to have sometimes other Christian traditions that will value the Bible, but that will be able to navigate their tradition with other things, with other philosophical sources, with with Plato, with Aristotle, with others. Like you're reading Thomas of Aquinas. They have a longer intellectual and deeper intellectual tradition than evangelicals up to a certain extent. Now, I'm not saying that all evangelicals are not sensitive to things that are outside, the Bible, but it's primarily Bible focused, and the worldview is primarily that. And if something emerges in society that is not aligned to what they deem to be the will of God, that they discern in the Bible, then of course they will react. And especially if they view their country as being founded on Judeo-Christian values, of course they will react.
Yes. Now, you mentioned one of the tenets of the evangelical movement is the conversion of a given soul from a life of, I guess, wretchedness to
Yeah,
live in accordance to Christ. So
yeah.
how would a typical evangelical reconcile that principle with, say, their perception of those who are of the political liberal or the left of their politics as not just someone who's wrong-headed, but someone who's irredeemable and is a threat to their cherished values?
Yeah, this is also a very good question, because it's now playing out in the political sphere, and we can start with just saying that in the evangelical world there are different perspectives on how one is saved. Um, so if you're more from a reform perspective, you will believe, for example, in predestination, in the idea that God has elected before the creation of the world certain individuals to be saved. Those that are not elected will be automatically reprobated and will not be saved. So there is that perspective. There are others that are more in line with, there's this idea of collaboration between individuals and God, that it's not just God that chooses, but individuals have a role to play. They have to exercise faith in order to, be converted. So it's depending on the camp, of course, you find yourself. But essentially, for like those that I study in my book, for example, I'll give you the example of neo-charismatic Pentecostals and how they see often their political adversaries, especially those that are more progressive, those that they deem being against their Christian views or values. First of all, they understand the world as being engaged in a what they call a spiritual conflict, a kind of a spiritual war between God and Satan, between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between sin and goodness. And they believe, like they have a thorough biblical worldview, that in the world at the moment, there are supernatural, invisible entities that have an impact on what's going on in the world. Christians have a responsibility to pray so that God will bring about his will in the world. But in the spiritual realm, there will be opposition. And this opposition is often uh, in the form of spiritual forces that they will label as being demonic forces that will influence individuals that are not converted They could influence individuals, but they could also influence communities. They could influence political parties. Political parties could be, in their estimation, demonized. Okay, and their goal is, of course, to engage in spiritual warfare against that. And how they do that, of course, through prayer, through spiritual warfare prayer, but through their activism also, to push against the forces of darkness that are impeding on their way of life, on their country, in their community, in their churches, in their neighborhood, and so on. So essentially for them, it's a very dualistic world. It's very dualistic. It's between the forces of good or the forces of light versus the forces of darkness or the forces of evil. And Christians have a responsibility to engage in that battle. And this is why you constantly hear some of these key leaders talking about, for example, when I heard one recently by the name of Lance Wallnau talking about Kamala Harris, saying that, you should listen carefully because demons are talking through Kamala Harris. See, so when you're literally, now you're going a step further. You see, you're not just saying, okay, demonic forces are kind of influencing, but now essentially possessing individuals. You're literally demonizing your political adversary. And by doing that, you're disqualifying your political. You see, you're saying this individual is illegitimate. This person is illegitimate to exercise any kind of political authority or power. And we cannot leave that in the hands of these people because we're going to be controlled by evil forces. You see? So this is why they're mobilizing Christians. They're going across, like people like Lance Wallnau and others. They're going to churches. They're going to swing states. They're going to specific places in order to mobilize voters to, vote for Trump because Trump is the ultimate solution to not have this, evil agenda, political agenda, impede on the lives of Christians. So the thing is, with the idea of spiritual warfare, what we need to understand, however, is that spiritual warfare is a Christian idea. It is not non-Christian. It exists. You can read it in the Bible. It exists. But the thing is, they've taken this to a level that, you don't see necessarily in the Bible, and you don't see either in the history of the Christian tradition. Like literally demonizing political parties and people and saying essentially they're demons. And if you look at a Democrat and you look at a Republican, you're going to see the demonic. You don't have that. When you look at spiritual practices in the early Christian church, you look at the Desert Fathers, who were ascetic monks in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. They went and they moved to the desert to fight the devil. But their spiritual war was not against people. You see, it wasn't against individuals. It was against their own evil, personal, interior inclination. It was against their own struggles, their own deficiency that they were fighting. You see, it was for them to become better people, more loving individuals, more patient, more people that have more faith in God. So the spiritual warfare that they engaged in was an inward, conflict between what is called in the Bible the flesh and the spirit. Okay, but what has happened now is that everything has been turned outwards, and it's not about like them. It's not about are you becoming a better loving Christian? Are you becoming a better tolerant? Are you exercising the character of Christ in your relations with others? You see? So the spiritual warfare has been kind of turned outwards, and those that disagree with us are those that are the problem, and it's not us. You see? So political adversaries, people that are not saved, are often seen in that light. They're under the forces or their understanding. And Paul is going to use, even the Apostle Paul in the Bible is going to use people that don't understand the Christian message. Their hearts have been veiled by Satan, okay, by the God of this world. Their hearts are in darkness. But Paul's aim was to, convert them to the Christian message. It was to talk to them about the liberation or the liberating effect of the Christian message, of how to really be free from their addictions and their problems and their personal issues, and freely live their life for Christ. That's what Paul wanted for when he was talking to preaching the Christian message. But they've turned this into a political message, unfortunately. And for a lot of evangelicals that don't embrace this view, they see it very damageable for their own Christian witness, for their own faith.
Yes. Yeah, since you mentioned the early church fathers, what do you suppose are their views regarding the spheres of religion and the sphere of politics?
So that is a very good question also. The early church fathers, they're not at the point where religion and politics are really intermingled yet. This really happens later, a bit later on. You're going to have around the 4th and 5th century Christian emperors that will bring that sphere together. So you're going to have the rise of Christendom, right? When, of course, Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. That's going to happen in the 4th, 5th century. And then the penetration between religion and politics is very clear. There's no distinction. There's no idea of secular, of the secular. It doesn't exist for a lot of them. And of course, when you look at it from a Christian perspective, it makes perfect sense. Because from a Christian perspective, if God is the ultimate source of everything, if God created all things, okay, which Christians believe, God created all things ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing. So God's creation is a free gift. Wasn't obliged, no obligation on the part of, he didn't feel lonely. It's just free gift. So everything that is belongs already to God. So technically, for a Christian, there is, if you're coherent in your way of understanding the relationship between God and creation, if you're coherent, there is no distinction. There is no secular sphere where it's not affected by God somehow, or it's shielded by, the divine. There's no such thing. So it's so I don't have any issues with that, in fact, from a Christian perspective. My sense is, if you're trying to conquer a secular sphere, if you're engaged in a spiritual warfare, you see, like a lot of these neo-charismatic Pentecostals that I talk about in my book, with their the concepts of dominion and all of that. If in your mindset you say to yourself, we have to conquer this space, okay? We have to conquer this secular space for God. Then you don't really believe that God is the source of all things. You're acting as those that you're denouncing, you're acting as a secular. You actually are believing that there is a secular space that you need to conquer, you see, which philosophically makes no sense. And theologically makes no sense if you are a Christian and you understand the doctrine of God and creation. Because God has created all things. There's nothing outside the purview of God. So there is no need to help God conquer a spiritual kind of secular space that is not, that has no rapport with him. God is not taken off guard by what people think secularism is. You see, so it's even their spiritual warfare theology is flawed in my sense, as if you understand theology correctly and the relationship between God and creation correctly, it's flawed. You see, but the thing is, of course, in the Middle Ages, with the emperors and the battles between popes and all of that, there has been a problem, and it became a problem in and of itself because there were quests for power, and a lot of the people that were supposed to exhibit Christ-like uh, virtues did not, and that's true. See, but ultimately, there is in the Christian mind supposed to be this understanding. There is no secular space to conquer.
Yes. Of course, in Matthew's gospel, I believe Jesus says, render what is Caesar's unto Caesar, and render what is God unto God.
Yeah, and that's important. That's a verse important, and that verse is important, and actually it's been taken to speak about uh, distinct spheres. But at the same time, we need to be careful when we read this, because if you render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, which is right in the context as you pay taxes, and you render unto God what belongs to God, which seems to be the service of God. That means, like, the religious service. But what belongs to Caesar, from a Christian perspective, needs to be understood that everything that belongs to Caesar actually belongs to God.
Mhm.
You see, because even Paul will say in the letter to the Romans in chapter 13, no authority exists unless it has been appointed by God. So even Paul understood, and Paul was in a very tough context. He was in the context of the Roman Empire. Even Paul was saying, the authority that the emperor has, he has it because it's God that's given him that authority. So in that Christian kind of worldview context, it's even what belongs to Caesar doesn't really belong to Caesar, it actually belongs to God. But I understand that has been often used as promoting the distinctiveness of both spheres of secular and religious. And of course, the introduction of those both spheres has been facilitated with the Enlightenment, with the Reformation also. The Protestant view is again that. So it's hard. Like the Catholic view is not that. The Catholic view is more holistic. The Protestant view is more this separation of church and state, but at the same time, you have these evangelicals that are trying to conquer the state. Like it becomes like difficult philosophically, I think, to reconcile that with a robust understanding of Christian theology, classical Christian theology, and an understanding of the doctrine of creation.
Right. So in regards to a figure like Trump, so do American evangelicals, I suppose the typical one, do they do, do they put their theology at the back seat in favor of their political views, or do they try to rationalize the emergence of such a figure like Donald Trump with their theology?
A lot of them have tried to rationalize the rise of Trump with their theology. You see, like for Trump, um, when you look at the figure of Trump, this is why many journalists, many people in the left, that don't support Trump, they have a hard time with evangelicals that support Trump, because they feel like this guy doesn't represent you at all. Like he doesn't, he doesn't share your values. He doesn't like he's been, you know, he's been married 3 times. Like he cheated on his wife, and like he doesn't seem to exhibit, Christ-like virtues or values. So we don't understand why you're supporting him. See, but there's always a way out for some of these people. Like, for example, I mentioned, I have a chapter dedicated in my book, in chapter 1, I think, about Lance Wallnau, where he talks about this Trump, where he was revealed by God that Trump would be this kind of new messianic figure for a time such as this in America, where America needed to return to God. And he had this revelation while reading the Bible. He was led to read Isaiah chapter 45, which speaks of this Persian king by the name of Cyrus the Great, who lived in the 6th century before Common Era. And he made an association between Isaiah 45 and the 45th president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. He made that connection. He just like, oh, the God revealed that to me. So he went on and talked about Trump as this kind of Cyrus figure, where in history and in the Bible, when we talk about Cyrus, Cyrus is essentially a non-believer. He's a pagan. He's a pagan king who worships other gods, not the Jewish God. And God, despite that, in Isaiah chapter 45, will say that Cyrus is his chosen one, his Messiah. So he uses even the word Messiah, which means his anointed, okay, which is another word for Christ. Okay, so he calls Cyrus his Messiah to a specific function, to a specific role. And that role is to liberate the Jews from their captivity. They had been captive in Babylonia for 70 years. Now they were granted by Cyrus, who had conquered the Babylonians, to return into their land and rebuild their sacred temple. So he's seen as a liberator, and God has chosen him for that purpose. You see, this is very revealing because it makes us understand something about what it means to be a Messiah figure. The term Messiah, often when we talk about Jesus Christ, see, people think that Jesus Christ is his last name. Like you would say James Bond, Bond, James Bond, like Christ, Jesus Christ. It's not his last name. it's his function. It's his role. Jesus the Christ. So the anointed one, or the anointing that was given to individuals was to represent God in a particular role. It was a selection by God of an individual to play a specific part, to do something specific. And Cyrus is that. And for them, like for people like Lance Wallnau and evangelicals that kind of embrace this Cyrus Trump paradigm, they see Trump, you see, they kind of read the Bible with that Cyrus figure, and they see Trump as a kind of parallel to that. You see, and they're going to say, you see, in the Bible, there's all sorts of flawed figures that God has used, like King David, who committed adultery and killed the wife of the man that the man not killed the wife, but committed adultery with the wife of the man he killed, and so on. So you have imperfect individuals. You see, and God uses them. The Apostle Peter, who denied Christ 3 times, and God made him the leader of the church, and so on. So they say God can use anybody. He's going to use Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is a special figure, and he hears us, he listens to our grievances. He's the one, of course, he listened to their grievances. He needs their vote. He needed their vote. It was important. So we need to understand the relationship that they had is very transactional. It's very transactional. He needs them, they need him. They have grievances. You see, they have problems with abortion. Trump, was able to put 3 conservative judges on the Supreme Court. They love Israel. Israel is important for them in their understanding of eschatology and the end times. Trump managed to get the move from, the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is a big move for them. It fulfills biblical prophecy. You see? So Trump is doing everything to cater to their needs. And for them, that's significant. So they're going to adjust, in a sense, their theology, in a sense, but at the same time, it's the way they read the Bible. You see, the way they read the Bible, they kind of they have a very subjective reading of the Bible. They kind of insert their own personal experiences and context into biblical text without really taking much stock into the original, the original context in which the Bible was written. What's the political context? Who's this figure? How did this play out? And really understanding that, prophets in the Old Testament, for example, they prophesied things, but it spoke to their time. It doesn't necessarily, everything that you're reading completely applies to your situation in America. The Bible doesn't talk about the US. You see? So it's their hermeneutic also that contributes to the way they can legitimize their political choices, the way they live their lives, the things that they adhere to. Their hermeneutic plays a big role in
Well, let's end with mentioning the end times appropriately enough. So
it.
how do you suppose the typical American evangelical, how are they preparing for that day when all things come to an end?
Yeah, there's several views about eschatology, but what is being played out now, what we see most is there are two perspectives. One is that Christians believe, some evangelicals believe that they're really living in the end times, and that at any moment now Jesus can return and rapture the church. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, rapture,
Yes, yes.
where they believe that only Christians that have accepted Jesus Christ as their personal savior, Jesus will come back on the clouds, secret return, and will rapture them. And after that, what will happen on the earth will be a period of tribulation where God will bring his wrath and judgment on the inhabitants of the world. And after that period of tribulation, Jesus will return with the raptured church on earth to establish his kingdom. So there's Christians that live in this expectation that any moment now Jesus might return, and we need to be ready. We need to live holy lives. We need to be pure. We need to evangelize. We need to be, we need to do what we need to do. There are others that see, yes, they're in the end times up to a certain extent, but they have a view where for them it's about building the kingdom of God now on earth. It is not that Jesus will rapture the church and the church will be spared from tribulation and he will come back and he will establish a kingdom. No, Jesus, for them, they kind of read the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, as this is the responsibility of Christians now to be busy. They kind of recall a parable of Jesus where he says, occupy till I come. Be busy, be occupied, do the work. That means build the kingdom now. So for them, it's essentially kingdom now theology. So they're here in the world to transform the world into the kingdom of God, transform America into the kingdom of God in order to prepare the return of Christ. When the kingdom will be established, then Christ in their minds will return to take possession of the kingdom. Now, both of these people, those that we call dispensationalists that believe in the rapture, and these dispensationalists are premillennialists. That means that they believe that Christ will return before the millennium, before this reign, this reign of peace of 1,000 years, literal 1,000 years will happen. That's what they believe. These are the rapture people. they still believe that they have to be busy. So this is why they're still engaged, a lot of them, in politics, that occupy till I come. See, be busy, but I might return anytime. Whereas the others, they're not expecting any kind of rapture soon or whatever, but for them, it's building the kingdom now. And they are what we call post-millennialists, meaning that Christ will return. The millennium is now. The building of the kingdom is now. So Jesus returns after the building of the kingdom to take possession. So this is essentially how they live out their eschatology. Some of them call this kind of eschatology victorious eschatology. Now, victorious eschatology fits very well with this post-millennial perspective where you're building the kingdom now, because they see in a victorious eschatology a church that will rise in the world, that will take its place, that will manifest the power of God, that will be victorious. A church that will go through persecution, that will go through tribulation. You see, whereas the rapture people, they see, oh, we're raptured before the hard times come. Whereas the post millennials, they see that, in this world, we're building the kingdom, but we might have opposition. You see, we might be persecuted. There will be tribulation at the same time through this building of the kingdom. See? So this is why they both, even if they think in terms of rapture or think in terms of a long-term project, they still both can be very much active politically.
Well, I think that's a good note to end the program. Thank you very much, Professor André Gagné, for joining the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.